Marissa King had always been a woman of structure, power, and precision. As the warden of Blackridge Correctional Facility, one of the most secure prisons in the state, she commanded respect from her staff and fear from inmates. Her name alone was enough to silence any unrest inside those gray concrete walls. Tall, stern, and always dressed in crisp navy blue uniform, she walked the corridors with the kind of authority that few dared to challenge. From the outside, she was the perfect embodiment of law and order. But what no one knew was that beneath that strong exterior, she carried an invisible weight, a deep, aching loneliness that grew heavier with each passing year. Her career had consumed everything. In her 20s, she was ambitious, determined to climb the ranks in the correctional system. She quickly made her way from guard to supervisor, then finally to warden. Promotions came, but so did sacrifices. Her marriage fell apart before she turned. There were no children. She moved into a small house just 15 minutes from the prison, living a life of routine and solitude. Weekdays were spent inside the facility, and weekends felt hollow. She didn't attend social events, didn't keep in touch with old friends. Her life was isolated, revolving entirely around the prison she controlled. Still, she found comfort in her job. It gave her a sense of purpose and stability. The predictability of procedures, the hum of security cameras, the routine inspections. They were her rhythm. She often stayed late into the evening, reviewing files or walking the cell blocks herself, rather than delegating the task. The inmates noticed her presence but kept their distance. They knew Warden King wasn't one to cross. Everything started to change during the intake of a new group of inmates transferred from a nearby overcrowded facility. Among them was Darius Cole, a man whose physical appearance stood out instantly. Even in the dull beige prison uniform, he had an undeniable presence. His posture was relaxed, his eyes sharp. At 6 feet tall, with a chiseled jawline and calm expression, he didn't fit the usual image of hardened criminals that passed through Blackridge. Marissa noticed him during the medical intake process, but at the time, it was only a passing glance. Marissa tried to dismiss her growing curiosity. She reminded herself that this was dangerous territory. A warden should never cross lines with an inmate. It was unethical, unthinkable, and yet it was happening. She couldn't explain it, but something in her life had shifted. The first crack in her control had formed. But what made him even more dangerous was his ability to read people. He noticed the small things, the way Warden Marissa King lingered near his unit during her rounds, the way her gaze paused when she looked in his direction. It didn't take long for him to figure out that she was intrigued by him. He didn't act on it immediately. He waited, watched her patterns, and allowed the tension to build. He knew exactly what kind of woman she was. Strong on the outside, disciplined in her role, but empty inside. He had seen it before in guards, social workers, even parole officers, people who wore power like armor to protect something broken inside. Darius began to play his part carefully. He was respectful, never too friendly, and always quiet when she passed. He made small gestures, returning a dropped file, offering to help clean a hallway, speaking calmly during conflict. Everything was deliberate. He didn't want to come across as eager. He wanted her to believe she was in control. That was how trust began to form. She started assigning him more duties, quietly giving him privileges not afforded to other inmates. A few extra minutes out of his cell, access to cleaning supplies without a guard watching. A shift in the warden's office under the excuse of maintenance. The first time they were alone in her office, the air was heavy. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He let silence work in his favor. And when she finally crossed the line, offering him a private cleaning job after hours, he knew he had her. From that point on, it was no longer about survival. It was a game. He had managed to blur the line between inmate and warden, between law and impulse. He didn't know how far she would go for him, but he intended to find out. What started as quiet manipulation was now turning into a dangerous dance, one that could only end in disaster. Chapter 3. Marissa King had always believed she was in control, even when her personal life spiraled into silence and solitude. But with Darius Cole, she found herself doing things she never imagined. It started small, an extended work detail in the administration office, then the casual allowance of second helpings at meals. As weeks passed, the line between professionalism and personal interest dissolved entirely. She started bending rules, adjusting schedules, and quietly bypassing protocols to keep Darius closer. At first, she convinced herself it was harmless, but she was already sinking into something she couldn't undo. It didn't take long before she began smuggling small items into the prison. Darius had asked her, in his calm and respectful tone, if he could have a notebook and pen to write. She agreed. Then it was a razor for grooming. Then snacks. Eventually, it escalated to a burner phone, something she had confiscated dozens of times from inmates in the past, only now she was hiding one herself and slipping it into a mop cart when no one was watching. Every time she helped him, her heartbeat raced with a mix of fear and thrill. She had been numb for so long that danger for the first time felt like life. Darius played his role perfectly. He never demanded, never acted entitled. He always framed his requests with care, cloaked in vulnerability or casual charm. Marissa told herself she was helping someone who had changed, who had potential, that she too deserved something more than loneliness. But deep inside, she knew what she was doing wasn't right. The guilt tugged at her every night, yet she couldn't stop. She had fallen under his spell, one that was crafted not with love, but manipulation. Staff members began to notice subtle changes. A few guards whispered about Darius being too lucky. Others noticed the way Marissa lingered near his unit, the way she seemed softer in his presence. But no one had proof, and no one dared confront the warden directly. Her position was too high, and her discipline record too clean. Still, suspicions started forming, especially among older staff who had worked with her for years. They saw cracks forming in the strong image she had built. Meanwhile, Darius's power inside the prison grew. With access to a phone, he started connecting with people on the outside, communicating with friends, sharing secrets, even recording private conversations. He never told Marissa what he was doing with the phone, and she never asked. She didn't want to know. She just wanted to preserve the illusion they had created. To her it was a connection she had longed for. To him, it was leverage. Every favor she granted gave him more control. What Marissa didn't realize was that Darius wasn't just using her for luxuries. He was planning something bigger. He was documenting everything: messages, audio clips, even blurry photos taken through the phone's scratched lens. What she thought was a secret romance was turning into a web of blackmail, and she was already caught in it, deeper than she could imagine. Marissa had begun to feel physically unwell months after her secret affair with Darius started. At first, it was small things: occasional fatigue, random headaches, and a persistent low fever that came and went. She attributed it to stress and long hours, brushing it off as burnout. But as weeks passed, her symptoms intensified. Her weight began to drop, and she felt drained even on days when her workload was lighter. She tried to ignore it, forcing herself to maintain her routine, hiding her weakness behind the sharp, authoritative mask she wore every day. But deep down, fear was beginning to stir. One afternoon, during a mandatory health screening for staff, the facility nurse recommended that Marissa undergo some routine blood work. She agreed reluctantly, not expecting anything serious. A few days later, the results came back. Marissa was called into a private room and informed she had tested positive for HIV. The nurse was professional, gentle even, but the words struck like a hammer. Marissa didn't respond. She simply sat still, numb, her mind struggling to process the reality she had just heard. Her first instinct was denial. There had to be a mistake. She wasn't the kind of person this happened to. She lived cautiously, kept to herself. She didn't take risks, except now she had. Marissa left the room without a word. She scheduled another test privately at a clinic in a nearby city under a different name. The result was the same: HIV positive. The second confirmation shattered any illusions she still held. As the weight of the diagnosis settled in, so did the truth. There was only one person she had been intimate with in recent memory, Darius Cole. Her body had betrayed her, but it was he who had delivered the damage. Anger rose quickly. She began to spiral emotionally. One evening, after the staff had gone home, she summoned Darius to her office, under the excuse of a cleaning task. He entered casually, like always, confident, with that same smug calmness in his face. Marissa stared at him in silence, her heart pounding. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. Instead, she watched him slowly pull a folded letter from the inside of his prison uniform and place it on her desk. It was a medical notice, dated over 2 years prior, from the health department at his previous correctional facility. It clearly stated that Darius had tested positive for HIV and had been informed of his condition. The proof was undeniable. He had known all along. He had withheld the truth, knowing what it could mean for her. And worse, he had used her body and trust to further his control. She felt sick, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. Every moment she had thought was personal. Every touch and glance had been part of a cruel manipulation. Still, Marissa told no one. She filed the letter into a drawer, locked it, and walked out of her office as if nothing had happened. But something inside her had shifted forever. Her silence wasn't strength anymore. It was fear, shame, and rage, all twisted together, waiting for a release. And that release was coming. Chapter 5. Marissa's world had begun to unravel, slowly but steadily. After discovering the truth about Darius's condition and realizing how deeply he had betrayed her, something inside her broke. Her once perfectly maintained routine began to slip. Her sharp attire became wrinkled, her hair less polished, and her eyes more sunken with each passing day. She no longer held the same commanding presence that once echoed through the halls of Blackridge Correctional Facility. Her voice, once steady and authoritative, often trembled. She became forgetful, missing scheduled briefings and skipping staff inspections she once led without fail. The staff started to take notice. Guards who had worked under her for years exchanged uneasy glances during meetings. Whispers filled the locker rooms. Something was wrong with Warden King. Some believed she was sick. Others thought she was mentally unraveling under the pressure of the job. But none of them knew the truth. Marissa kept everything bottled inside, terrified of the consequences that would follow if anyone found out about her secret affair with an inmate, her diagnosis, or the manipulation he had endured. Her silence became a prison of its own. Darius, on the other hand, sensed the shift in her. He noticed her erratic behavior and recognized the fear in her eyes. Rather than retreat, he tightened his grip. With subtle threats and careful insinuations, he began to remind her of what he had: videos, messages, photographs, and enough evidence to destroy her career and reputation. If she didn't continue helping him, he warned, everything would come to light. She was no longer just someone he had seduced. She was now his pawn, and she knew it. Marissa found herself caught in a spiral. She couldn't go to the police without implicating herself. She couldn't tell the staff without risking exposure. So she continued to bend the rules, silently obeying Darius's demands while her body and mind crumbled. She rerouted supply logs, gave him more unsupervised hours, and deleted surveillance clips that showed them together. With every cover-up, her guilt deepened. She had once enforced the law, now she was breaking it for the man who had ruined her. At night, she barely slept. Her dreams were plagued by images of her office turning into a cell, the door locking behind her, guards pointing fingers, and Darius laughing from the shadows. She started taking sleeping pills, first one, then two, then more than prescribed. Her judgment faltered further, her paranoia growing. She began to think her staff suspected her, that they were watching her every move. Even casual glances felt like accusation. Despite the growing chaos, she tried to keep appearances. She still walked the corridors, still carried her clipboard, still tried to maintain the illusion of control. But underneath, she was unraveling. She had no one to turn to, nowhere to run. Every path led to ruin. The affair that once gave her the feeling of being wanted now left her feeling trapped, used and diseased in every sense of the word. And the man who caused it all still walked the halls, smirking in silence, knowing he held all the power. It was a routine shakedown that brought everything closer to the edge. A young correctional officer named Trevor Ward, just 6 months into the job, was performing a random cell inspection in Darius Cole's unit. He wasn't looking for anything specific, just following protocol. But beneath the thin mattress, inside a torn book cover, Trevor found a small, outdated mobile phone, a contraband item, but not unusual in a place like Blackridge. What made it alarming, however, was who the phone belonged to. Darius was already known to be receiving favors, though nothing had ever been proven. Now, the discovery of the phone placed everything under a microscope. The phone was confiscated and handed over to the prison's internal investigations unit. Marissa was informed immediately. Her stomach sank as soon as she heard the words. She kept her composure in front of the staff, nodding as if she was handling the situation calmly. But inside, panic surged through her. She knew that phone held everything: photos, voice notes, perhaps even messages she had sent. If the investigators unlocked it, they'd uncover the truth about her involvement, the affair, and potentially even her diagnosis. Her career, already on a knife's edge, would be destroyed. That night, long after the prison lights dimmed and the corridors fell silent, Marissa walked alone to the evidence room. She used her master key to enter, her pulse thundering in her ears. There, in a labeled evidence bag, was the phone. She stood still for a long moment, staring at it, trying to talk herself out of what she was about to do, but fear won. She slipped the phone into her pocket and quietly left. In a secluded corner behind the old boiler room, she smashed it against the concrete floor, again and again, until it was nothing but shattered plastic and glass. Then she gathered the pieces into a brown paper bag and threw them into a burn barrel near the prison's maintenance shed. But Darius already knew. He had expected this outcome. Before the phone had been discovered, he had synced it to a cloud service using the smuggled Wi-Fi access from a staff computer. Photos of him with Marissa in her office, voice notes where she whispered promises, even brief videos of her bringing him food. Everything was saved. He confronted her the next day in a moment of eerie calm. In a hushed tone, he told her he had copies, and if she didn't continue to protect him, they'd reach the outside world. The threat wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Marissa understood him perfectly. Cornered, she agreed to meet him in the basement supply room later that night, under the pretense of moving equipment. That space, tucked behind layers of locked doors and thick concrete, had no cameras. She told herself she was just going to talk, to reason with him, maybe convince him to stop, but her mind wasn't clear anymore. It was twisted with fear, desperation, and a growing fury she could no longer contain. She was past the point of damage control. In her mind, there was only one way out. The next morning, long before the sun had risen, the prison halls buzzed with the low, urgent murmurs of something gone terribly wrong. A janitor had reported blood smeared across the door of the basement supply room. 2 guards rushed to check and found the door slightly ajar, the air inside heavy with the metallic stench of death. There, slumped against the far wall, was the lifeless body of Darius Cole. His prison uniform was soaked in blood, his face was swollen from a struggle, and a maintenance screwdriver protruded from his chest. There were 7 deep wounds, each one driven with brutal force, the kind only rage could fuel. The scene was chaotic. Officers secured the area and called for an emergency lockdown. Investigators arrived within the hour. Supply room had no surveillance coverage, making it the perfect blind spot for whoever had committed the murder. But while the killer had chosen the location well, the execution wasn't flawless. A few feet away from Darius's body, they found traces of blood leading toward a narrow side door, blood that didn't belong to the victim. As detectives combed through the prison, the surveillance team began reviewing footage from nearby hallways. One clip showed Warden Marissa King entering the stairwell that led to the basement late the previous night. She wasn't scheduled to be on site at that hour. More importantly, she was alone. The footage didn't show her leaving. Hours passed. There was no sign of her departure, no documentation of any after-hours activity logged by her office. Her car, however, was gone from the lot by sunrise. In the staff locker room, officers discovered something else, a freshly burned trash bin. Inside were the melted remains of a correctional officer's uniform. The name tag had been scorched beyond recognition, but the shape of the pins and a few strands of dark hair clinging to the collar hinted at who it belonged to. The timing, the location, and the damage, it all pointed to an inside job. One that was personal, calculated, and desperate. As staff began to piece things together, the question turned to where Marissa had gone. Her home was empty. Her phone was off. Her last known whereabouts were now tied directly to a murder scene, inside the prison she ran. A formal manhunt was initiated. Some of the older guards, though shocked, admitted privately they weren't entirely surprised. Rumors had been swirling for months. Her behavior, her secrecy, the sudden favor shown to Darius. It had all seemed off, and now it made a chilling kind of sense. Inmate interviews began that afternoon. Some claimed to have overheard arguments between Darius and the warden in the past. One even mentioned hearing him brag about having power over her, though few took it seriously at the time. Now it all came together: an affair, manipulation, blackmail, infection, and finally, murder. What had once been a silent scandal hidden beneath the surface of routine had erupted into full-blown tragedy, and the woman once trusted to uphold justice was now its most wanted suspect. Marissa King was found 48 hours later in a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, nearly unconscious in a bloody bathtub. She had slit her wrists with a razor blade, the same type she had once confiscated dozens of times from inmates during shakedowns. The motel staff had called emergency services after she failed to check out and didn't respond to knocks on the door. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, where doctors managed to stabilize her. She survived, but barely. As she lay in a hospital bed, pale and weak, guarded by 2 correctional officers, the weight of her decisions finally came crashing down around her. When she was well enough to speak, detectives questioned her. At first, she stayed silent, her eyes distant, her face expressionless. But over the course of several interviews, the dam broke. She confessed to everything. Not just the murder but the entire chain of events that led to it. The affair with Darius, the secret phone, the smuggled items, the blackmail, and finally, the truth about her HIV diagnosis. She described how he manipulated her, how she let herself be controlled out of fear, loneliness, and shame. Her voice cracked when she recounted the night in the basement supply room. She claimed she didn't go there intending to kill him, but when he laughed at her fear, when he reminded her of the control he still had, something inside her, she said she didn't remember how many times she stabbed him, just that she couldn't stop. The media erupted with the scandal. News outlets ran the story for weeks. A prison warden, once respected and feared, had not only engaged in a criminal relationship with an inmate, but had ended it in cold-blooded murder. Headlines ranged from sensational to sympathetic. Some painted Marissa as a predator, others as a broken woman driven to desperation. The truth lay somewhere in between. During the trial, her defense argued temporary insanity brought on by emotional trauma and psychological manipulation. The prosecution, however, presented her as someone who had full control over her actions and simply didn't want to face the consequences of her decisions. Witnesses from the prison staff testified about her strange behavior in the months leading up to the murder, and forensic evidence supported that she had planned the encounter by choosing a location with no surveillance. In the end, the jury found her guilty of second-degree murder, abuse of power, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. She was sentenced to 28 years in a maximum security women's prison, a grim twist of fate, now forced to live among the very people she once ruled over. She arrived at the facility without fanfare, avoiding eye contact, her name already infamous inside those walls. Inmate 50936, formerly Warden Marissa King, now lived behind bars, her powers stripped, her secrets exposed. The very system she had controlled for decades had now consumed her. The story of her downfall served as a chilling reminder of how even those in positions of authority can fall prey to weakness, and how one wrong connection can destroy a life beyond repair.